Yeah, my name is Clint Penick. I am an assistant professor at Auburn University, and I study ants. If you can't tell behind me, I have all kinds of ant things, an Ant-Man mask. I'm obsessed with ants, but particularly I've been really interested in ants in cities. So a lot of my work focuses on what kind of wildlife is able to stay alive in our cities, looking at insects mainly, and how interactions between ourselves as humans influence the types of species that we live with. So, this story began over a decade ago when my team and others were surveying just what lives in New York City. New York is the oldest and the largest city, or one of the oldest, and certainly the largest city in the United States. And yet, we actually no one had ever surveyed what ants lived there before. So our team was one of the first that went in there and started looking under, rocks in the city, in between pavement cracks, and trying to figure out what ants were actually there. And one of the things that we turned up in this was an ant that nobody had seen in New York City before. This was exciting at the time, so when we saw it, we knew that it wasn't anything that was found locally in North America, and the news kind of picked this up. And my favorite was that the New York Post, they tried out some nicknames for it, and the one we use is the ManhattANT. So it was actually a reporter at the New York Post who came up with that name. But yeah, this ant, it turned up, and at first, like, it was pretty rare, and we were like, okay, this ant is here. It's not too crazy to find a new ant. We didn't think it was a new species. We thought it was probably something that was introduced, that was living there. But then over the years that we were working in New York, this ant kept turning up more and more and more. All of a sudden, it was now, I say it's the second most common ant in New York City. And up until about a year ago, it never actually officially had a name. So that was part of our work, was actually to go out, collect these, and finally figure out once and for all what the species was. Yeah, so the ant. So when we finally we keyed it out, or sort of we worked with a specialist in Europe. So our hunch was that it was a species that had come from Europe. So we contacted the specialist there and the genus that we knew this ant species was from, and he was able to compare it to all of the other species within this group, and then find out it is this ant called Lasius emarginatus. That's its binomial scientific name, and it is a species that's native to Europe. And one of our hunches is that it came over with the trees that they plant on the streets and the traffic islands and all around New York City. Probably one of the most common trees that's found across New York is called the London plane tree, and hence its name. It's from London. It's a European species. And so what we probably think happened is that a colony of these ants had moved into, basically a bucket that a new tree would have been in, and then it got shipped over across the Atlantic, and they found a city that was ripe for the taking, and so they've just expanded since then. One of the main things, and why I really got interested in, or how I got interested in working in New York City on ants, in the first place, was that I was interested in studying ants that eat our garbage. And so trying to understand, like, when we drop litter on the ground or we spill our ice cream cone, we don't think of it as that big of a deal, but an ice cream cone is like a huge amount of calories for an ant colony. And the most common ant in New York City is called the pavement ant. They're also from Europe, but they were probably introduced, at least 150 years ago, if not longer. And they've kind of been naturalized, like, many immigrants that have come to New York City. And the pavement ant is all over the pavement, as their name would suggest. And they're the first ant. If you drop food on the ground in New York City or a lot of different cities across the United States, it's likely the pavement ant that's going to show up. While we were doing these studies, one of the interesting things that we noticed, though, was that as this ManhattANT species was expanding, it was taking over the sidewalks, but we didn't have any evidence that it was actually eating human food. So all of the different studies we were doing looking at that, the ManhattANT just kind of ignored the food we put on the ground. It didn't have any of the sort of chemical signatures that we find in other ants that eat our food. So we were kind of scratching our heads, like, how could this ant be so successful on sidewalks in this massive concrete jungle if they're not eating our food. And so when we started paying attention to them, we followed their foragers and looked where they were going. And most of the time, what we saw is that they were forming these trails up into the tops of tree canopies. And so New York City, even though it is, like I said, a concrete jungle, there are thousands of trees still in the city, and then they're planted all along the sidewalks. And what we think this species is able to do is go into these tree canopies, and then they collect something called honeydew. And honeydew is basically poop from other insects that feed on plant sap. And so these insects are getting so much sugar that they literally have too much sugar, so they just poop it out. And that is a pretty good resource for ants that are stuck in the city without other things to eat. And so we think that's one of the reasons why they've been so successful, is that there were no other ants in New York City that were able to take advantage of honeydew in these really urban areas. And so when the ManhattANT showed up, there was just what we'd say is an open niche, a place for this species to fit that no other ant species were filling before they arrived. Right now, we don't know if the ManhattANT is going to be one of these giant problem species, or if they're just going to integrate into city life like the pavement ant has. And so I mentioned this pavement ant species that has been in the United States for, at least 100, 150 years. And they really aren't causing a lot of harm to native species as far as we can tell. And it's largely because they're mostly restricted to our cities. So you don't find pavement ants in the forest, you find them on the sidewalk. So there's already not a lot of biodiversity they can disturb. The ManhattANT, on the other hand, we find actually doing well on the sidewalk, but also doing well in native forests throughout the city. So I think there is a little bit more cause for concern that the ManhattANT, as it spreads, it's already spread into New Jersey, up Long Island, that it's going to start moving from urban habitats and could potentially invade some of our intact native areas. And there, it might prove to be a strong competitor and wipe out some of our native biodiversity. And then the other thing is just in the city, like I said, these species, this species seems to be feeding on honeydew in these street trees. But the insects that make honeydew are actually pests themselves. And what often happens if ants start feeding on the honeydew, they'll protect those pest species from predators and parasites and all the other things that control their populations. So they can actually have a negative impact on the health of trees in the city if they're benefiting the pest of trees. So that's another thing that our group is kind of interested in, trying to figure out what's going on with the ManhattANT. Yeah, my story is always, you hear a lot about entomologists, insect biologists like myself, who grew up and they caught bugs as kids all the time, and they had ant farms and all of this different stuff. And that was not me. I was not a kid that was going crazy about bugs. I think I liked them as much as any kid. But I was more interested really in punk rock and skateboards than I was in collecting bugs. But I did name my first punk band when I was in middle school the Army Ants. So there must have been something about ants that interested me from an early age. And for me, that really blossomed when I got into college and started working with a professor who studied ants. And he was at the time basically the world expert on fire ants. And so I started doing research on them, and I just got hooked. And one of the things that I really love about working with ants is that you can study them pretty much anywhere. So I'm studying them in New York City, but the first paper I ever published was research that I started conducting on fire ant colonies that lived in my backyard. And I just thought that was amazing. I could go out, and do research on things that live like right out my back door. And it was totally unknown stuff, totally new to science. And as a very young scientist in college, I could go and actually publish something new on that for the field. And so that's one of the things that's really hooked me to thinking about urban ecology and focusing a lot more on species that we encounter every day, but maybe haven't taken all the time to stop and ponder what their lives are like.